Well, this is long overdue. It really is sad to say that my Sly 4 review is probably one of my most watched videos. Yet, if I were to be completely honest, it kind of sucked. My main gripe with that essay is that I didn't give the game the time of day. I rushed through the whole game, completing all the objectives and ignoring all the side content, and just based my opinion on that half-assed playthrough. Therefore, I never really gave it too much of a second thought and just kind of shat on Thieves in time because it was popular to do so. I mean, yeah, at the end of the day it garnered a lot of success and attention, but I can't help but feel a bit of imposter syndrome knowing that I didn't quite play the game. So, with that out of the way, I hope to give Sly 4 another chance. Was I too focused on the problems that I missed some of the more positive aspects? I mean, the reviews, while noticeably worse than its predecessors, were still generally positive, so as much as I don't quite trust game journalists, there must have been something Sanzaru did to deserve that. Who knows? That time that I played to review it was my first time through, so maybe a second playthrough will open my eyes a bit. I don't know, but there's only one way to find out. When we first boot up the game, we're greeted with this title screen. And, yep, I've already found a little issue to nag about. Why isn't this game called Sly 4? Sly 2 and 3 weren't afraid to use numbers to show their sequential order, so it's kind of strange why Sanzaru chose the title Sly Cooper Thieves in Time instead of Sly 4 Thieves in Time. I guess we can tell it's the fourth installment, since it happens right after the third one. But it's a bit off-putting, and it gives the impression that I might be playing a spin-off game instead of something that's part of the actual Sly Cooper canon. Anyway, so the opening of the game starts off pretty much where Sly 3 left off. The entire Cooper game had pretty much retired. Sly had gone off to live with Carmelita, Murray had gone on to become a professional race car driver, Bentley formed a very close relationship with Penelope. All seemed well until Bentley started to notice that the writing on the pages of the Thieves Raccoonus were disappearing. Seeing something very fishy, he went out of his way to reassemble the team. Coincidentally, Sly himself was getting that old itch to go back into thieving, so he didn't really need much convincing to get back onto the field. In fact, none of the other gang members really had any trouble getting back into business. In a way, that could be a good thing. This isn't Metal Gear Solid. It's not supposed to have hours upon hours of cutscenes. In that sense, Sanzaru did a decent job with the pacing of the introduction. The gang reunites in a manner that doesn't waste too much time. And I guess I'll add that the more I think about it, the new cutscene style doesn't look too bad. It is a little more animated, and it feels more expressive compared to what was seen in the originals, which makes them overall more lively to watch. All that being said, I still have a problem with Sly's old itch coming back. When he decided to put down the cane in Sly 3, it was done. There was no turning back. He had concluded that he was much happier living a life with Carmelita Fox. With this context, it makes what Sly does to her all the more infuriating. He really is a bit of an asshole, because it makes him look like he doesn't take any responsibility for his actions. The Sly Cooper that Sucker Punch had created would have given it more thought. He would have contemplated the consequences of what he was about to do and actually put Carmelita's feelings into consideration. And it was possible to do it in a short amount of time. Sucker Punch did this before with the Panda King. He had a little internal struggle with himself in order to finally come out of retirement, but it never felt like it dragged on for too long. If Sucker Punch could do it with the Panda King, then Sanzaru should be able to do it with Sly. But no, it's like they didn't put an ounce of thought into how they were going to transition Sly back into his old self. This completely assassinates him as a character because in the third game, he was literally being crushed to his demise, and all he could think about was how he'd been so cowardly not to start a relationship with Carmelita. You're telling me that after all that, he just wants to go back? I don't know. Maybe Sly never really faked his amnesia, considering he seemingly forgot about this ever-important moment. But I said I was going to try to be positive, right? Well, the tutorial is pretty decent for what it's worth. The game gives a good feel for each of the characters' different playstyles. However, there are some subtle things that really bother me. For one, the game constantly has these very weird quick-time events in the middle of the level. I mean, there's nothing inherently wrong with it, but they feel forced in there as they usually didn't signify an impactful moment. Take Infamous 2 as an example. Holding down the shoulder buttons was meant to add a level of weight to Cole's ultimate sacrifice. You basically didn't want to release them because it'd mean that he'd die. And considering the relationship we built up with him throughout the game, that was a really sad moment. Unfortunately, with the Sly 4 intro, this isn't the case, so they all feel out of place. Was it really necessary for there to be a quick-time event for Sly to steal the sword? You can literally just sit there staring at Sly's goofy-ass face for the longest time if you don't press any buttons. I feel like this part would have run a lot smoother if it had just been one cutscene. Granted, there are little sections that require quick-time events scattered throughout the game, so it's not like Sanzaru just stuck this in the intro and never touched it again, but it makes for some very awkward moments. And then there's the way this game introduces the characters. I already talked about how Sly's been character assassinated. I guess one other thing I'll mention is that I wish they emphasized how rusty he was with his abilities after his long hiatus. Besides a little fall he experiences while climbing a pipe, he's as polished as ever doing the ninja spire jump and the rail walk. In fact, I might go on to say for the most part, he controls pretty damn well. It's almost as if he never retired at all. There could have been a way to show how he wasn't as refined in his skills. Like, maybe he wouldn't be able to climb up as swiftly, or he wouldn't be as nimble whenever he walked across a tightrope. It would have created more immersion in the sense that we, the player, would feel how out of practice he is. But Sanzaru didn't want to take any chances, and it technically played it safe, which is kind of funny because of how they changed Murray. This character is not the same. As soon as I saw him belly surfing on that van, I knew that my opinion of his depiction in this installment was not any different compared to before. Yeah, they really emasculated this guy. Compare this to how the Murray was introduced in Sly 2. The way he thunderflops into the museum truly presents him as a force to be reckoned with. It really demonstrated how he grew from the original game, where he was just a cute hippo. The sight of Murray belly surfing just tears apart that image altogether, and, dare I say it, is very offensive to him as a character. Now, granted, he still uses his brute strength a lot when you play as him, but now, it doesn't feel like the character and gameplay match up because of how degraded he's become. He's literally now the definition of a fat, pathetic weakling, and it's such a shame to see. As for Bentley, his character is mostly unscathed. Even though so much of his dialogue is just a series of one-liners that fall flat, he still continues to be the nerdy intellectual that plots out the heists. His gameplay, on the other hand, has taken a serious downgrade. He's added these Dr. Octopus tentacles to his wheelchair. Unfortunately, as cool as these are, he never really does anything with them, and they seem to just be there for design purposes. One change that I find really frustrating is that now he has to switch between explosive and sleep darts. Before, this extra step wasn't necessary, but now, if Bentley wants to equip to an explosive, he needs to access a menu to switch to that category. It makes playing as him really annoying as it ruined the pacing of his gameplay since I always needed to stop and sift through this menu every time I put a guard to sleep. If there is one redeeming factor to Bentley's gameplay, it's the hacking minigames. There are 3 this time around. The one introduced in the intro is identical to its predecessor. You control a little tank that makes its way through the terminal while blasting other security. They actually somewhat expand upon it by adding other features, like the blue power-up allows bullets to ricochet off walls, and the purple allows for slower but heavier firepower. The second minigame has Bentley going through a side-scroller blasting away at enemies while he levels up by collecting stars. To be honest, this one felt kind of repetitive because the boss and the enemies were the same for each level. There was very little variation. Finally, the third minigame has us using the 6-axis controls to steer a little ball into a goal. I absolutely hated these ones because of the motion controls, and the only compliment I can give is at least these were short. But anyway, the intro ends with Sly stealing a samurai's sword to get to Japan. He ends up fleeing the scene after getting busted by Carmelita. He inserts the sword and off they go to feudal Japan. So, was the intro as bad as I remember? Yeah, for the most part. I was able to come up with a couple of positives when it came to the pacing and cutscene designs, but that's pretty much it. it still feels like it disrespects so many characters, and some of the plot points feel as if they're not fully fleshed out, and almost makes me think that Sanzaru just threw stuff against a wall to see what sticks. But maybe I'm being too judgmental a little too soon, for we entered into the first episode of the game, turning Japanese. So in this playthrough, I actually tried to look for all the clue bottles instead of just beelining it to the end. To be honest, while the concept is the same as it was in Sly 2, the bottles were a lot harder to find, and quite a bit of it has to do with the fact that I can barely hear the clinking sound they make. It tends to blend in with some of the other background noises, and it overall feels slightly softer, which made for a frustrating experience finding all of them. Another thing they bring back from the second game are the loot scattered around the open world. Although, unlike its predecessor, this time you have to get back to the safe house without taking damage, and before time runs out. For the most part, they were a very enjoyable challenge, as they forced you to figure out shortcuts to get back to the safe house the quickest way possible. Unfortunately, if you fail, it's hard to figure out how to get back to the respective loot to try again, which is really frustrating. But Sanzaru is very good at making this rewarding, for not only do you get a lot of money for bringing these back, but you also get to read a description about them on a display. This is a nice touch because it makes them feel like they have some significance to the culture and environment of the level instead of just being another trinket you pick up. There are also these hidden Sly Cooper icons, and collecting a certain amount of them will unlock a special unlockable. Although these aren't very rewarding since they amount to minimal changes, like the paraglider getting a different design and Sly turning into a rendition of Batman known as Ultimate Sly. Yeah, I wouldn't say they're worth the trouble. But going back to the environment, the atmosphere really gives off that film noir vibe. The entire level takes place at night, which is very fitting with the stealth platforming gameplay, and a little semblance of life, like the chickens running around, makes it feel like a lively village. However, there are a couple of issues that kind of take away from the experience. In fact, there's one really glaring issue that completely ruins it. But we'll get there. So, first of all, there's the Binocucomp controls. They've been switched. It used to be that you were able to move the Binocucomp with the left analog stick while zooming in and out with the right. Now that it's been reversed, it feels very awkward to say the least. Why on earth did they change this? It really was unnecessary and makes taking photos feel unnatural. The other complaint is the suit of armor. Sly can now don different costumes that provide him with unique gimmicks. One aspect I really like about this is that if you go back after acquiring a specific costume, you can enter a previously inaccessible secret area, which adds to the sense of exploration. The one you get in this level is the Knight costume, and it has the ability to deflect fireballs with its shield move. That's all fine and dandy, but why is it that whenever Sly moves around in it, he's always slow as fuck? I get that the suit of armor is heavy, but they could have at least given him the option to lightly jog. It's a minor problem, but it always felt like it dragged the level down when I suddenly had to switch into the suit of armor and I slowed to a crawl. But at the very least, the guard armor felt different to play because the supposed star of this chapter, Sly Cooper, isn't. He plays too similar to Sly. Each of the ancestors have one special ability that separates them from Sly, and Ryoichi's ability, the Leaping Dragon, is very much the same as the Ninja Spire Jump, except you can reach farther distances. I do like the levels that are designed around this. There are a lot of spotlights and lasers getting in between platforms that really tests your dexterity. But, as I said before, he very much is too similar to Sly to the point he doesn't feel like his own character. Plus, I kind of found his personality to be very condescending, especially when he talks to Bentley. Every time Bentley tried to express his worry for him, he always shuts him down and replied that he's a ninja. He already knows what he's doing. Ha! Well, that's awfully arrogant of him, seeing as how he gets his cane stolen from him pretty easily from Ellen. And speaking of which, the villain is a complete joke in this episode. Even though Sly talks about how El Jefe burned down several villages and is an expert military strategist, what we get instead is akin to a billionaire playboy. This scene right here says it all. It's just so uncanny. What does this say about him? Also, he literally cannot tell the difference between a fake chicken and a real one. Seriously, what a fucking dumbass. Not to mention his boss fight is piss easy. I guess there's some spectacle to it with his lightning and fire attacks, but you pretty much just run around in a circle, stun him, and whack him. Rinse and repeat. It's so boring. But I've been beating around the bush for too long. Yeah, I think most of you know the moment I'm talking about. This part just single-handedly destroys this level, and it really makes me just want to turn off the game. And that's the scene where Murray dresses up as Madame Geisha and starts dancing to make the guards horny. Words cannot describe how insulting this is to Murray's character. The Murray I know from the PS2 games would not cross-dress out of nowhere and start dancing. It's just such a shark-jumping moment. You know those memes where your dad walks in and says, "Are you winning, son?" and he quickly tries to hide what he's doing? I'm waiting for the Murray dancing rendition of that. You've gotta wonder what Sanzaro was smoking to insert something like this in the game. What's worse is that the music mostly just repeats itself, so you'll be listening to the same melody over and over again, so it's torture to the ears as well as to the eyes. But wait, I've got something nice to say about this part. The button prompts follow the rhythm of the piece, and it's pretty forgiving when you fuck up, which kind of helps this go faster. It's a shame that this had to ruin the episode because all the other missions are actually quite fun. The pickpocketing tasks are as good as before, the game brings back the RC car from the third game, and the physics aren't as sensitive, which makes it a lot easier to control. Some of the gimmicky sections like using the lantern lights to ward off the bugs were well designed and brought a different kind of challenge to the platforming. It's all very functional and decent stuff. It's just sad that this Murray dancing moment is so obnoxious, it's what leaves a lasting impression on this level. But what's even more egregious is the constant loading that happens between missions. This really gets in the way of the progression within the game. They're long, they happen too frequently, and worst of all, it feels like Sanzaro didn't even try when it came to making them feel interactive. Take Spider-Man Shattered Dimensions as an example. Even though the load times were long, the player could go through multiple hints. You could still probably feel the length of the loading, but it was at least something. With Sly 4, while it gives you a hint to read, you can't really scroll through several of them, so you're just stuck staring at the Cooper icon bouncing up and down while you wait for it to finish. Considering that there are so many loading screens to sit through in between missions, it makes me think Sanzaro didn't really respect our time. But moving on with the story, so Sly defeats El Jefe, but not before a mysterious figure drops down to pick up Ryuichi Cooper's stolen cane. Coincidentally, one of the minions accompanying him drops a sheriff's badge, and the gang inserts that into the time machine to travel back to Tennessee Kid Cooper's time period. And this brings me to the next issue concerning the story. A lot of the events rely on coincidence. It was by accident that this goon just happened to drop the sheriff's badge, which just happened to be in the right time period for them to travel to. This gets a lot worse as the gang involves themselves with more time traveling, and it makes me think that Sanzaro didn't care about explaining how it all works in the Sly Cooper universe. Having an item from each time period show up at the place just when they needed it is just bad writing. But moving along to the next chapter in the game, Go West, Young Raccoon. Overall, I think this is probably one of the best OSTs of Thieves in Time. It's fitting for the Wild West tone, and it kind of reminds me of the Cabins theme, which is another track I like. One of the first missions of the level has us trying to reach outlaw status by performing petty crimes like stealing a lollipop and drawing over toothpicks posters in order to get into prison Tennessee Kid Cooper is being held in to bust him out. I actually think that this would have been a good feature to have in the game, having different stages of notoriety for Sly, similar to what Sucker Punch did in the Infamous games. Sadly, not only did they reserve that feature for this mission alone, but most of the crimes you commit are juvenile. I mean, drawing over toothpicks posters? Stealing a lollipop? I mean, for the most part, Sly Cooper generally felt like it had always been targeted towards children, but the missions in those games were usually not this childish. Which brings me to the bad jokes. It's around here that I started to notice that most of the dialogue was basically joke, 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 joke. Usually, for some reason, this was always at Bentley's expense. I mean, was it really necessary for Sly to comment on Bentley's mustache? It makes Sly look like a bit of a douche. Maybe they also bantered with one another in the original trilogy, but there were also a lot of moments where the trio was able to show that they cared for one another, as seen through the many hardships they went through. Yeah, sure, the intro of Sly 2 had Sly making fun of Bentley for taking the task at hand too seriously, but in the end, he also let Murray and Bentley walk away while he got arrested, showing that he cared for them. Because Sly 4 doesn't have those in-depth moments, the relationship of Sly, Bentley, and Murray feels a bit strained at times. And while we're on the topic of strained relationships, I might as well talk about Carmelita's appearance in this level. So, I guess I do like how the narration switches to her speaking so that we can get a better understanding of her perspective, but the presentation with this scene is just so awful. Why is Sly smiling when he finally meets up with Carmelita? If I were him, I'd be struggling to articulate the words needed to tell her why I left. This isn't the Sly that we know from the original trilogy. This feels like a different person. He has zero regard for other people. What Sanzaru failed to understand was that Sly wasn't somebody that just cracked jokes all the time. That was a small part of his character. But then Carmelita makes a rather strange decision here. She ends up falling for Tennessee Kid Cooper. Considering she does this with another ancestor, as we'll see later, it kind of feels very forced, and one easy fix for this would be for the game to make it seem as if she's feigning it to annoy Sly. But no, based on certain parts in the story, it seems as if she's actually falling in love with him only to fall for another one later on, which kind of makes her look like a hooker. I guess she doesn't have the moral high ground after all. She's as bad as Sly. I guess I thought I might talk about all the negatives here, because now I'm going to go over the few things this level did right. Namely, Tennessee Kid Cooper. Of all the Cooper ancestors, Tennessee's the most refined because he manages to feel different while still feeling like his gameplay was inspired from Sly's. As a gunslinger, he almost plays like a third-person shooter, which is a departure from the usual stealth takedowns that Sly is accustomed to. However, at the same time, he still maintains the parkour mechanics. His special move is to lock onto multiple targets at once by holding down the R2 button. However, because there's a focus meter that dictates how long you can do this for, you can't abuse it. Also, his level involves a lot of rail grinding, and I think this is one of the few areas that Sanzaru got right. It feels tight, responsive, and most of all fast-paced as you leap left and right to avoid obstacles. In fact, a lot of the overworld have grind rails in the form of railroad tracks, and it makes navigation a lot easier. And then there's the prison outfit. It's still really annoying that you have to walk really slowly with it. However, this one is better than the guard armor because there are multiple uses to it. You can now push items back and forth using the ball chained to Sly's foot, and roll over laser grids as well, which greatly speeds up the movement. So, there are at least a few good things I can say concerning this level. You might be wondering why I've said so little about Toothpick, and that's because he's such a forgettable villain. His backstory is nothing to write home about, because he was always a crook to begin with. He only manages to capture Carmelita and the Cooper gang because he was in the right place at the right time, and they get rescued shortly after. Is incompetent even a good enough word to describe him? Plus, he's just one of those stereotypical New York gangsta mob bosses who have all of his minions cower in fear. Even listening to his voice is irritatingly annoying. Finally, there is this guy's boss fight. It mostly involves him bouncing around until he finally stops and starts to spin, causing tornadoes to launch everywhere. These are pretty easy to jump over and avoid. Finally, he gets dizzy, and Sly needs to turn into the jail costume and punch him into the furnace, or we have to hit him in the head multiple times. First of all, why does this game keep reusing the same gimmick of hitting bosses in the head? It feels very redundant and mindless. Maybe Sanzaru thought it would be really satisfying mashing the square button over and over, but it ends up being super repetitive. Spider-Man Shattered Dimensions had something similar, and that game wasn't afraid to switch it up with dodging and weaving as you punched away. That could have provided more thoughts to these parts. Second of all, it was around here where I realized how Sanzaru had brought down the difficulty for these bosses. For every time I died, the boss wouldn't have their full health. They'd usually only have whatever they had left just before you were killed. It often made a lot of these fights really trivial. Then again, the faster I can beat this game, the better. So the Cooper gang and Carmelita end up falling off a cliff, and it looks like the end is nigh for them. They plummet to their deaths and the credits roll.
Thank God I don't have to play this game anymore.
Nah, I'm just kidding. So Bentley quickly grabs the guru's necklace that was around Murray's neck, and he throws it into the time machine, and this just happens to take them to the Cretaceous period, where they just happen to run into another one of Sly's ancestors. What? This really doesn't make any sense at all. If this game's time traveling had an ounce of logic, the necklace would have just made them go to some random period that didn't have a Cooper around, and they would have been stranded there, struggling to figure out how to get back. But no, we need to somehow get them to the next Cooper ancestor, so let's just use coincidences! But here we are at the clan of the Cave Raccoon. This is kind of the start of the downhill fall for this game. It's not quite rock bottom, but this is kind of where it began falling apart. So, first of all, there's the animal pelt costume. This allows you to leap from one end to the next, but only if there's a target on the other side. Not only does this make this costume super situational, but there isn't really much else to do with it besides this. In the next episode, there's a costume that's somewhat similar to this in which you shoot arrows at a specific target, but at least with that, the gimmick was used in a different way to expand upon the platforming. The animal pelt leap ability doesn't really create any new interesting scenarios for Sly to traverse, so it felt very uninspired and not very fleshed out. Get it? Because he's technically wearing flesh?
That's not funny.
But that's kind of a minor issue compared to how they handled Bob Cooper's arc. They do the same thing that they do with the Guru, in which all the characters can somehow understand him, despite the fact he speaks complete gibberish. But the bigger problem is his relationship with Murray. So, Bob is pretty much gotten out of shape, so what better person to man him up than the Murray himself? Well, Murray basically turns into Jordan Peterson and tells Bob that life is about struggle, and then he plays a bunch of minigames. And these are okay. They all involve you abusing penguins in one way or the other. In one of the minigames, you slap them. In another one, you hit them with a baseball bat. You play whack-a-mole with them, and launch them into pterodactyls. It felt really uncomfortable how many times we injure or kill penguins, and considering what you do later in the game, I have to conclude that Sanzaru has an animal abuse fetish. While the previous minigames I mentioned are doable, balancing the egg with the 6th axis was painful. This was the final minigame I had to pass to complete this section, but the fucking penguins would jump up and down so fast that the weight kept being redistributed too frequently across different sides. This caused me to drop the egg many times, costing me my lives. And once I ran out of those, it was back to the beginning of the training montage. Maybe they were trying really hard to simulate what an actual workout feels like, but this just felt unforgiving and repetitive with how Murray forced us to repeat so many minigames if we sucked so badly. But the worst part is how the way Murray treats Bob reveals him to be a big, fat, hypocritical jerk. So he coaches Bob back up and takes all the credit for it. Then, when it's his turn to climb a wall, he can't do it. Therefore, much to Murray's disbelief, Bentley brings in Bob to do it. The way Murray reacts kind of makes it sound like he never liked Bob to begin with, despite the fact he had just taken all the time and effort to train him up to his peak. Murray went from being this gentle and lovable hippo that wasn't afraid to use his strength to help others, to, well, Pete Jordanson. Sanzaru for some reason thought that Murray was a character that ate a lot and kind of put a lot of emphasis on it. I mean, look at his idle animation. He turns down to broccoli in favor of scarfing down to hamburger. Get it? Because he's a glutton?
God, how many other things are they going to ruin?
I guess this is a good transition into Bob Cooper's gameplay. It's actually quite solid for the most part. The platforming is very intuitive. Bob has a very similar technique to Nathan Drake from the Uncharted series, where he extends his hand out to let the player know he's about to jump to another wall, which is very helpful when it comes to timing out my leaps. There are a lot of deadly obstacles that require some precision, like falling eggs and spikes that come out of the wall, but it all feels very fair for the most part. After that platforming goodness, we get some rather weird missions that involve Murray abusing some penguins. I mean, seriously, why do they make him do this? It just makes me feel bad for the penguins, and it just makes Murray look even more like a scumbag, because he clearly has a lot of pleasure with the pain he's inflicting. And then we get one more platforming mission where Bentley tries to tail the Grizz while he solves puzzles and pickpockets guards. Honestly, I feel like some of the elements of this section could have been implemented in other Bentley parts, like the puzzle where you have to match the picture with the highlighted features of the statue. They kind of remind me of that one minigame in Sly 3 that had Bentley trying to find the clues in the landscape pictures. Although, tagging the Grizz in the butt is kind of juvenile, and makes me not take this villain seriously. In fact, let's talk about him now. He's a complete joke. His character is kind of like Dimitri in the sense that he'll only talk in rhyme, but while Dimitri was really funny with this kind of personality, the Grizz is just super annoying with his constant rhyming, and the sad thing is that that's all there is to his character. I get that his origin story involves him getting resentful for people rejecting his art, but considering how obnoxious he gets with how all of his lines are in the form of a rap song, I don't blame those critics. In his boss fight, it gets even more random because instead of having a challenge that was rhyming or music-based, he has a skating match with Murray. Why not do something similar to what Bentley did with Octavio, in which Murray and the Grizz have a rap competition in which the player has to match the timing of the rhythm. Actually, on second thought, that would have been really cringe, but at least it would have kind of been related to his character. So, overall, Clan of the Cave Raccoon was a real disappointment, and it just kind of gets worse with Of Mice and Mechs. So, yeah, I'm sure we all know that this is the point where it's revealed that Penelope has switched sides. It's out of the blue, it's not handled well, and it just reinforces this sort of fan-fiction-y element to the entire story. But we'll get there when we get there. There are actually a lot of good things about this level. As I've mentioned countless times, the atmosphere is top-notch. But here, I think it's especially well done because there are so many high ledges you can stand on and just pan the camera to see a very beautiful city in the far-off distance. I couldn't stop looking up at the skyboxes, just seeing the fluorescent moon shining down on the level. The Archer costume really expanded on the platforming sections, as sometimes you had to time your shots correctly before a laser cut the wire or fumes scorched you, which created more emphasis on precision compared to other costumes. And that's it. I sort of feel like I'm praising the same things over and over again. Atmosphere and a couple of gimmicky costumes can only take a game so far. So, Penelope, what's there to say that hasn't already been said? If I were to make a top 10 list of the worst plot twists and stories, this would be number 1. Maybe I'd be a little more forgiving if they built it up better. At the start of the stage, the gang doesn't get too much exposure to the Black Knight. There are only 2 missions involving him before the big reveal. The way I'd change this is to simply have more missions where the Cooper gang confronts him. During these encounters, the Black Knight would drop clues of his real identity without giving it away. Over time, the Cooper gang would slowly begin to piece together who the Knight is, which would add to the shock value of the revelation it was Penelope the whole time. What this game does instead is have the Cooper gang interact with the Black Knight as little as possible, and then during one random mission, Bentley just stumbles upon Penelope coming out of the suit. Like, if there was some build-up to the climax of this plot twist, maybe I would say they at least handled it well enough to make us understand why it's an emotional gut punch for Bentley. But no. With the way it's dumped onto the player out of nowhere kind of makes the whole plot point null. Perhaps it's a good time to talk about Carmelita Fox's arc, as I've been kind of neglecting her. In the previous episode, she seemingly learns to accept Sly, although I really don't like how the game goes about doing it. Basically, she comes to the conclusion she was always lying to herself, and that Sly was always going to be who he was no matter what. Okay, I get this sense that she's kind of getting over herself, as begrudging as it might sound. Wait a minute.
Only when I'm trying to catch you. But I find Gareth charming. He has a good heart, even if he is a headstrong goof.
Yeah, Carmelita feels kind of indecisive when it comes to how she develops as a character. Just after she stated that she was willing to forgive him, she falls for another one of his ancestors, just like she did with Tennessee. In fact, I'd go so far as to say there isn't really much of a conclusion to her conflict. Sly and Carmelita are at each other's throats at one moment, then she gets captured, and they're back together again when Sly comes to rescue her. I swear that this is the entire arc these two go through. And once again, her falling for Galeth is kind of forced, because he is kind of a bumbling twit and my least favorite of the Cooper ancestors. He's the sort of guy who just barges into situations, and he constantly needs to be rescued. Also, his special ability, the catapult crash, is the equivalent of what Sly could do when scaling up walls, except he can now blast through barriers. To go on a bit of a tangent, this is one of the 2 areas where you get to play as Carmelita Fox, and for the most part, she plays like a relatively standard third-person shooter. My only question is, why did they even bother making her playable, considering how little we get to do it? She's technically in a safe house, so you have the option of free roaming with her, but she doesn't really have any missions of her own. She's just an afterthought. Like, Sanzaru just inserted her into the game as if to say, we'll make Carmelita playable so as to please the Sly Cooper base, but since we don't like her, we'll only give her a few levels. Ah, Glen Egan. Why? Just why? The final thing I'll say about this level is that I think there was a missed opportunity to develop the scenario of Bentley being absent from the gang. As soon as he realizes Penelope's betrayal, he tucks himself into his shell and swears to never come out again, only for him to emerge later after only 2 missions. This scene could have had more impact if it had lasted longer. How would the Cooper gang have operated without Bentley's planning? We never really get to explore that aspect. So when Bentley finally emerges from the shadows, having overcome his demons, it just doesn't feel earned. Sly 2 had something that was more of the reverse, since it explored how the gang would have operated if it was just Bentley by himself. However, since that lasted a bit longer and actually showed how Bentley gained a newfound confidence, it actually feels like one of the more memorable parts of the gang. In comparison, in this plot point, Bentley literally just disappears for a short period of time, then just reappears without any build-up. And considering that's how this episode ends, it just leaves a rather unsatisfied taste in my mouth. But I don't know, I'm getting close to the end of the game. Maybe these last few episodes will be enough to save it. Sly and the gang head to ancient Arabia to get into contact with Salim al-Kupar. Unfortunately, La Paradox's goons cause trouble, and yeah, you get the formula. Now, granted, the previous Sly games also had similar repetitive story beats, but they were able to disguise it by introducing a lot of good character moments and development. As you probably already see, Sly 4 doesn't have any of that, so it feels like it follows this very formulaic storytelling even more strictly. Anyway, I might as well talk about Salim al-Kupar. To be honest with you, it felt like Sanzaru basically reused a lot of elements from Bob Cooper for him. Ever since Ms. Dezebel foiled his operations and scattered his other gang members, he's resorted to becoming that of a voracious eater. Thankfully, we don't have to train him back up like we did with Bob, but there's really not a whole lot to say about him as a character. I guess he sort of chastises Bentley for being culturally illiterate, which makes him come across as being very arrogant, but that seems to be the case whenever Bentley tries talking to all the other ancestors. At this point, I could tell Sanzaru is running out of ideas of what to do with the rest of them. His special ability, the Cobra Climb, suffers from the same kind of issue of Ryuichi and Sir Galeth's abilities, in the sense that it's a faster version of a move that Sly already has. But as I did with the other levels of Sly 4, I'm willing to give the episode 40 Thieves some credit where it's due, namely the mission structure. This level features a couple tasks where they must be completed as a team instead of individually, which adds some unique design choices. For instance, there are several missions where the gang has to rescue Salim's partners, and in one of them, Sly and Murray accidentally trip a trap which sends both of them underground in a cavern. With the two of them unable to get in contact with Bentley, they must work together to clear away obstacles for each other. The game switches between the two perspectives every time one of them hits a barrier, and it creates a really dynamic experience. The platforming for Sly was at its best, as it forced you to look at each of the presented challenges in a different way. Some of the platforms are moving too quickly for him to jump on. Therefore, he must use the Arabian disguise to slow down time and carefully make these jumps. In another section, you have to navigate around several guards without allowing piles of gold to fall down, which forces you to think quickly when making your leaps and bounds. While Sly is doing that, Murray is on the other side trying to clear away waves upon waves of enemies. He has a lot of opportunities to wreak destruction, whether it be participating in mob fights or blowing up cannons with a turret. Overall, this mission felt like it really used the individual gameplays of Sly and Murray to the fullest. The other mission that's similar in style is when Salim, Al Kupar, and Bentley have to plant a bug in Ms. Dezipol's office. Initially, you play as Salim and help him find different areas to put speakers, only to then switch over to Bentley in order for him to put the finishing touches on each of the devices. It's nothing innovative or anything like that, but it does give way for more elaborate and complex level design. They could have easily just made a simple stealth mission for Salim, in which he just gets to plant a bug on Ms. Dezipol's desk. However, by combining his and Bentley's gameplay to pull off the task, it gives the feel that the heists are a group effort. Unfortunately, all that goes down the toilet with the Carmelita belly dancing minigame. It's as bad as the Murray cross-dressing sequence, and it's a spin to face to Carmelita's character. Carmelita is a competent cop. She's hard as nails. Remember that one time she took out General Tsao? She was able to prove to him that her being a woman didn't make her any less capable of catching him. So what does Sanzaru do to her? Sexualize her for whatever reason, because of course that's what I think of whenever I see Carmelita. Her shaking that ass and belly dancing? Just kill me. Just fucking kill me. In all seriousness, how did a scene like this get past the radar? It's like ESRB took one look at the butt-shaking scene and went, "Oh, this is perfectly fine, because it's a fox that's doing it. At least it's not a human being." Either that, or they never bothered getting up to this part. Which I don't blame them, considering how cringe this game is. And then we finally get introduced to the main villain of the game, La Paradox. They really didn't handle this guy well at all. Initially, when we see him in the first episode, he's only shown as a silhouette, adding a lot of mystery behind his identity. However, by the second episode, we already are given away who he is when it's revealed he was responsible for taking Carmelita to a different time period. So all the potential mystique behind the villain at that point, gone. Just like that, since we're already given away his name and appearance at the moment. But even if he was properly developed, it still wouldn't change the fact that he's the weakest of all the villains Sly has fought. He's a French skunk, for Pete's sake, and there's really nothing intimidating about him. As Sly chastises him at the end, he basically just had all of his minions do all the work for him. I mean, I guess he's supposed to be smart because he backstabbed Ms. Dezipol, and he meticulously kept the Cooper gang away from Carmelita in order for him to kidnap her. But there's really nothing else to say. The fact Nolan North gives him the most irritating, high-pitched, nasally voice doesn't help in his intimidation levels. Anyway, you fight Ms. Dezipol in an admittedly creative boss fight, and then the gang is at their lowest point. The Paradox has all the Cooper canes, and he's trying to rewrite history to make himself ruler of the world. Pretty cliche for a villain, I might say. And the three of them are all sulking as if all is lost. This follows the footsteps of Sly 2 and 3, in which there was one Dark Night of the Soul moment for the gang, where it feels like they've been defeated. However, there were certain subtleties that Thieves in Time fails to understand. First of all, these moments actually felt like they hit you right in the gut. Take a look at the setting. The Cooper gang is usually nowhere near safety during these parts. In Sly 2, they were hiding inside the Northern Lights battery, afraid of being discovered by Jean Besson's guards. In Sly 3, Sly was being crushed by Dr. M's monster. This might sound like a small detail, but the fact that the gang was in some kind of danger in their lowest moment added weight to the feeling that they needed to somehow power through this. In Sly 4, they're in the safe house, and it just sort of looks like a very minor situation. Murray literally has ice cream in front of him when this is going on, and with that one little sideways glance he makes towards the dessert, it kind of feels like he's not quite in a sad moment. And plus, a little while later after a call with Dimitri, the gang just sort of recovers like nothing happened. In Sly 2 and 3, these moments at least had some long-term effects for the characters, like Murray losing the van, or Sly coming to the realization he truly loved Carmelita. But in Sly 4, there's no such thing. But we finally made it to the grand finale. A good ending can make or break a game. So let's see if Sly 4 can redeem itself. Well, Sly gets captured in the dumbest way possible. I mean, he really couldn't see that was bait. He could have waited for some time before running straight to Carmelita. He and his ancestors could have plotted out a rescue mission. but instead he just runs headfirst like a dummy. Well, as I mentioned earlier, his ancestors show up, and I quite like how they handle this. It kind of reminds me of the Spider-Man Shattered Dimensions ending, in which there is one big level where all the Spider-Men get to show off their gameplays. It's similar in that sense, in which there's like a final challenge for each of the ancestors before they're sent off for good. But then we get to the final boss. It's just a quick time event sequence. I mean, it's not that frustrating, it's not too long or anything, but come on, this is supposed to be the final boss, you know, the part that's supposed to test everything you've learned thus far. And this is what they give us. Quick time events that we almost never had to use in the game. So, when all is said and done, Sly turns Le Paradox's squirrely ass to grass, and he is left dangling on the side of the structure. And Sly, once again, makes the stupid mistake of helping him. In my previous review, I criticized this part. But, you know, I can't believe I'm saying this, but I wish we saw more scenes like this. I wish that Le Paradox's weak form was just a ruse that he used to fool his enemies. I wish we could have seen Le Paradox deceiving more of his foes like this, because it has the potential to make him a cunning villain, to trick them into thinking he was weaker than he actually was. But nonetheless, Sly is still a stupid fuck for giving in to his ruse, but he's not the only one who embarrasses himself, for Le Paradox goes headfirst into a plane. Wow. What a fucking joke. But what is probably more of a joke is how this game's ending ruins the perfect conclusion of Sly 3. So all the Cooper members technically go on their own separate ways, just like the end of the third game, but while that game felt more fulfilling in how it wrapped everything up, Sly 4 literally takes a big pile of steaming shit on that by leaving it on a cliffhanger. A cliffhanger that we'll never know the ending of, since Anzaro was so incompetent they couldn't even finish a DLC to this game. Like, the third game just ended it so perfectly, and now they had to ruin it by leaving unanswered questions about Sly's whereabouts. Wow. And like I said, so the ending of Sly 4 left quite the bitter aftertaste. Well, is it any better compared to the last time I played it? Hell no, Thieves in Time is still shit. But I suppose I was able to find a handful of good things to say about the game if you paid close enough attention. Like, the atmosphere is top-notch. I thought the different costumes provided some interesting level designs and how they were used. Some of the old elements from the previous games felt expanded upon, such as the extra collectibles and Bentley hacking minigames. I suppose I'd be lying to you if I said the entire package was bad. In fact, maybe I'm crazy for saying this, but perhaps there's a good game in there somewhere, but it's weighed down by the infuriatingly bad character interpretations, dull story, mind-numbingly bad minigames that felt like it interfered with the experience, and an ending that is a pure insult to the original trilogy. So, my opinion is still the same, but if they had just taken one of the few positive aspects of this game and maybe expanded upon it a little more, then maybe there could have been something good on our hands. If all of the ancestors had the same idea as Tennessee Kid Cooper, in which their gameplays were all completely unique, they wouldn't have all felt like a bunch of carbon copies of Sly. If they had a more threatening villain, that would have made all the difference in me taking the stakes in the story seriously. I guess I'm willing to say Sly 4 had some potential, but in the end of the day it still fell short, and its very existence is just really sad. We didn't need a 4 since Sly 3 ended everything so seamlessly. This just created more questions than answers. Well, you get the point. At least we can imagine a universe where this game doesn't exist. I'm really tempted to just throw this game into waste bin, but I won't because I have too much respect for my games. Anyway, I'm Dave Reviews, and I'll see you guys later.